The stories they tell of the West are mostly about clear lines, lawmen and outlaws, settlers and savages, good and evil. But the truest stories, the ones that stick to your bones like a winter chill, they happen in the places where those lines get blurred, where they get crossed. This is one of those stories. It's about a man who was born on a line between two worlds, and who spent his life being pushed across it by other men's greed and other men's lies. The year 1880 found the West in a state of violent, convulsive change. The great herds were shrinking, the last pockets of free land were being fenced in with barbed wire, and the old ways were dying, one gunshot, one broken treaty, one railroad tie at a time. For Luca Redhawk, the world had been dying for a decade. He had learned early that progress was just a pretty word for destruction, and that a promise from the white man was as substantial as a puff of smoke in the wind. He was a ghost on the ridges, a man who belonged to no world and was wanted by two. To the white settlers, he was a half-breed, an object of suspicion and contempt, his Ute blood a mark of savagery they could never overlook. To the scattered, broken remnants of his mother's people, he was a Wanasi, a lost one, the man who had worn the blue coat of the army, the man who had guided the very soldiers who had brought the fire and the sword to their people. He existed in the space between a solitary hunter, his only companions the ghosts of his past and the weight of the bounty puck in his saddlebag. We find him not in a town, but in the rugged, sun-hammered wilderness of the Utah-Colorado borderlands. For 3 days, he has been tracking a man named Silas Kane, a rustler and a murderer with a $500 price on his head. The tracking is a silent, seamless art for Luca. He moves through the landscape not as an intruder, but as a part of it. He reads the story of Cain's passage in a single, overturned stone, and the nervous flicker of a lizard, in the way the wind has bent the grass. These were the skills his Ute mother, Shada, had taught him, a language of the earth that was truer than any spoken word. He is not a large man, but he is forged from the land itself, lean, hard, and withered as a juniper root. His skin is the color of copper, his hair long and black, held back by a simple leather cord. His face is a mask of stoic neutrality, but his eyes, a startling, pale gray inherited from a father he never knew, hold a deep, ancient sorrow. The look of a man who has witnessed the end of the world. He carries two weapons, and they are the two halves of his fractured soul. Slung over his back is a short, powerful bow made of Osage orange wood. It was his mother's, a gift to him as a boy, its grip worn smooth by her hands and his. Tucked into his belt is a rusty, pitted Colt Dragoon, a heavy, obsolete piece of hardware. He rarely uses it. It is a tool of the white man's world, a world he despises, but one he must occasionally navigate. He finds Cain making a cold camp in a small box canyon as dusk settles, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and orange. Cain is a big, brutish man, careless and arrogant, believing he has outrun the law. He does not see the shadow detach itself from the rocks on the canyon rim above him. Luca does not use the gun. He knocks an arrow, the movement a fluid, silent prayer. The bow was for hunting, his mother had taught him. The gun was for killing. He had done enough killing. The arrow is fletched with the feather of a red-tailed hawk, his namesake. He draws the string, the bow creaking softly, a familiar, comforting sound. He aims not for Cain's heart, but for the thick muscle of his shoulder. The bowstring sings. The arrow is a whisper of death. Cain screams as the arrow slams into his shoulder, pinning him to the ground. Before he can even reach for his pistol, Luca is on him, descending the rock face with the speed and silence of a cougar. He disarms the whimpering outlaw, binds his hands, and tends to the wound with a practiced, detached efficiency. He is not cruel. He is simply a force of nature, as impersonal as the wind that scours the rocks. Who the hell are you? Cain gasps, his face pale with pain and shock. Luca does not answer. He rarely speaks. His voice is a currency he spends with great reluctance. He takes the man's horse and leads his prisoner on a slow, 2-day journey to the nearest dusty outpost, a collection of tents and shacks called Purgatory Flats. He turns Cain over to the weary territorial marshal, collects his $500, and watches as his bounty is locked in a makeshift cell. He feels nothing. No satisfaction. No pride. The money is just a means to an end, the fuel that allows him to keep drifting, to keep the ghosts at bay. He is in the town's only saloon, a canvas tent that smells of stale beer and desperation, nursing a single whiskey, when his world shifts on its axis. Two prospectors at a nearby table are talking, their voices loud and drunk. "Heard tell that Captain Kane is running for mayor over in Rio Vista," one says. "Can you believe it?" Nathaniel Kane, a politician. Luca's hand, which is lifting the whiskey glass to his lips, freezes. The Namakanus a key, and locking a door in his mind that he has kept bolted shut for a decade. A door that leads to a room full of smoke, and blood, and screams. The butcher of the Gunnison, the other prospector, scoffs. "That man's got more blood on his hands than a slaughterhouse floor. I was with the supply train. I saw what he did to them Utes. Called it a battle. It weren't no battle. It was a massacre." "Well, he's a rich man now," the first prospector says with a shrug. "Got the deeds to half the valley. Says he's bringing the railroad in. People forget, when there's money to be made." Luca stands up, his chair scraping loudly on the dirt floor. He places a coin on the bar and walks out, leaving his drink untouched. The prospectors fall silent, watching the dangerous, silent man disappear into the night. Outside, under a cold, indifferent moon, Luca Redhawk stands for a long time, the desert wind whipping his long hair across his face. Rio Vista. Nathaniel Kane. The man he had once followed, the man he had once trusted. The man who had looked him in the eye and promised his mother's people safety and land, a promise of a new world where they could live in peace. The man who had then led his blue-coated troopers in a surprise dawn raid, slaughtering men, women, and children in a frenzy of calculated violence, all to clear the land for his own greedy ambitions. Luca had been on a scouting mission miles away. He had returned to a scene of hell, to find the smoldering ruins of his village, to find his mother's body lying by the river, a soldier's saber cut across her chest. The bounty hunter in him died in that moment. A new man, or perhaps a very old one, was born. He was no longer hunting for money. He rode to his horse, his movements no longer weary, but filled with a new, terrible purpose. He was no longer a ghost on the ridges, drifting without direction. He was a hunter again. But this time, the price on the head of his quarry would not be measured in dollars. It would be measured in the blood of every promise Kane had ever broken. He was riding to Rio Vista. He was riding into the heart of his own past. He was riding to war. Rio Vista was a town built on a lie. It sat nestled in a prosperous, well-watered valley carved by the Gunnison River, a jewel of civilization in the rugged wilderness. Its main street was wide and orderly, lined with new, impressive brick and timber buildings, a grand hotel with a proper dining room, a bank with a stone facade that spoke of permanence and security, and a mercantile filled with goods from the east. The town was a testament to progress, a shining example of what the New West could be. It was clean, it was orderly, and it was rotten to its core. Luca Redhawk rode into this town not as a hunter, but as an observer. He came in the late afternoon, the low sun casting long shadows that suited his disposition. He was an immediate and jarring dissonance. His dusty, buckskin-clad form, the powerful Ute bow slung over his back, the very wildness in his eyes, it all clashed with the town's cultivated air of respectability. Men in suits and bowler hats stopped to stare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Women in fine dresses pulled their children closer, whispering behind their hands. Luca was a relic, a ghost from the wild, and tamed past that Rio Vista was so desperately trying to bury under its new floorboards and coats of fresh paint. He ignored the stares, his pale gray eyes absorbing every detail. He was not just seeing a town, he was reading a story. He saw the new-cut lumber, the expensive glass, the sheer amount of money that had been poured into this place. It was the kind of money that didn't come from cattle ranching or farming. It was the kind of money that was dug out of the ground. It was the kind of money that his mother's people had been promised, and had died for. He stabled his horse, his quiet, efficient manner giving the stable hand no cause for conversation. He took a small, cheap room in the back of the boarding house, a room that overlooked an alley, not the main street. He needed to see without being seen. From this anonymous perch, he began his hunt, not with a weapon, but with his eyes and ears. He saw Nathaniel Kane for the first time that evening. Kane was not the hard-bitten, dusty cavalry captain Luca remembered. The years had transformed him. He was now a man of substance, of importance. He was handsome, with a thick, well-groomed mustache and hair the color of pewter. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, a gold watch chain draped across his vest. He moved with the easy, confident grace of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. Kane was in the middle of the street, surrounded by a group of the town's leading citizens, gesturing expansively toward the hills. Luca, watching from the shadows of his window, could hear the man's smooth, persuasive voice carrying on the evening air. He was talking about the future, about the railroad, about the smelter he planned to build, about the endless prosperity that was just around the corner. He was selling them a dream, the same way he had once sold Luca a dream of peace and coexistence. The town's leader's banker, the railroad agent, the cattle baron all nodded along, their faces shining with a mixture of admiration and greed. Kane was not just a candidate for mayor, he was a messiah. Luca felt a cold, familiar hatred twist in his gut. It was a feeling he had suppressed for 10 years, and its return was so powerful it almost made him dizzy. He watched Kane laugh, a hearty, confident sound that seemed to mock the very memory of the screams by the river. This man, this butcher, had washed the blood from his hands and remade himself as a pillar of the community. He had buried his sins under a town and was now preparing to be crowned its king. For the next 2 days, Luca became a part of the town's shadows. He listened. In the saloons, he heard the talk of Kane's generosity, of the jobs he had created, of the money he had invested. But he also heard the whispers. He heard the quiet, resentful talk from the small homesteaders whose land had been bought out for pennies on the dollar under the threat of foreclosure from Kane's bank. He heard the stories of prospectors who had mysteriously disappeared after striking a rich vein on land that Kane later acquired. He saw Kane's deputies, a group of hard-faced, well-armed men who were less peacekeepers and more a private army, their presence a constant, low-grade threat that kept the town in line. He learned that Kane's power was absolute. He owned the bank, he held the mortgages on most of the businesses, and he controlled the only law in the valley. He was a spider at the center of a vast, intricate web, and the entire town was caught in it. During his quiet reconnaissance, Luca found the ghosts of his own past. He found the bend in the Gunnison River, just a few miles from the town, where his village had once stood. There was nothing there now. The land had been plowed over, the cottonwood trees cut down. A large, new cattle ranch, flying a banner with a stylized C on it, now occupied the ground where his mother had lived and died. The graves, the sacred circle, the memorials, they had all been erased, buried under the hooves of Kane's cattle. Standing there, on that desecrated ground, the full weight of the last 10 years crashed down on Luca. He had survived. He had drifted. But he had not lived. He had been a ghost, haunting the edges of the world. Now, he had finally come home to his own graveyard. He had followed the trail of a man who had not just killed his family, but had tried to erase their very existence from the earth. He returned to his room as night fell, the cold fury in his heart now forged into a single, sharp point. The civilized man, Nathaniel Kane, had built a kingdom on a foundation of bones. Luca Red Hawk, the savage, the ghost, the sun, would be the one to tear it all down. His hunt was no longer just for a man. It was for a memory. It was for justice. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that before he was done, the river would run red again. In a town as tightly controlled as Rio Vista, secrets were a dangerous currency. Most people, out of fear or self-interest, kept their mouths shut and their eyes down. But the past has a long memory, and in the darkest corners of the town's saloons and livery stables, some memories refuse to die. Luca, in his silent, watchful quest, was not looking for an army. He was looking for a crack in the wall of silence that Nathaniel Kane had built around his empire. He found it in a man named Jedediah Pope. Pope was the town drunk, a pathetic, shambling figure who spent his days sweeping out the saloon for enough credit to buy his next bottle of rot-gut whiskey. He was a joke, a cautionary tale, a man who had long since drowned his dignity. But Luca, with his hunter's eye for detail, saw something more. He saw the way Pope's hands, though trembling, still held a broom with the muscle memory of a man who had once held a rifle. He saw the faded tattoo of a cavalry insignia on his forearm. And he saw the look in Pope's eyes whenever Kane or his men walked in, at just fear, but a deep, festering, and very personal hatred. Luca cornered him one night in the alley behind the saloon. Pope, startled and terrified, tried to scuttle away, but Luca's presence was a physical barrier. He didn't threaten him. He didn't even touch him. He simply stood there, a silent, imposing figure in the moonlight. "You were at the Gunnison," Luca said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It was not a question. Pope froze, his face, illuminated by the spill of light from the saloon's back door, turning a pasty white. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. "You were a corporal in Captain Kane's company," Luca continued, his voice flat, relentless. "You rode with him. I remember your face. You were one of the ones who believed his promises." The mention of the promises broke something in the old soldier. A wave of shame and self-loathing washed over his face. He sagged against the wall, the fight going out of him. "We all believed him," he whispered, his voice thick with the ghosts of a decade of whiskey and regret. "He told us it was a new beginning. A place for us soldiers, after the war. A place to build a life. He told us the Utes had agreed to the treaty, that they were moving on. He said we were their protectors." Pope slid down the wall, sitting in the filth of the alley, his head in his hands. The story came pouring out of him then, a torrent of confession that had been dammed up for 10 long years. He spoke of the dawn raid, of the confusion, of Kane's orders. He told us they'd broken the treaty, that they were preparing to attack the new settlement. Pope sobbed. He said they had killed a scout. It was a lie. All of it. We rode in. God, we rode in and they were just sleeping. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. He made us do it. He told us any man who didn't fire was a traitor. The old soldier looked up at Luca, his eyes swimming with tears. "I saw your mother," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I saw what he did to her after she tried to stop him. I've seen her face every night for 10 years. It's why I drink. To try and wash her away. But she never goes away." Luca stood over the broken man, his own face a stony and readable mask. He felt no pity. He felt nothing but the cold, hard confirmation of what he already knew. But Pope had given him something valuable. A witness. A chink in Kane's armor of respectability. News of the strange, silent half-breed's conversation with the town drunk traveled fast in a town starved for gossip. It reached Nathaniel Kane by morning. The report, delivered by one of his deputies, was that the new bounty hunter had been seen threatening old Jed Pope. But Kane was no fool. He knew this was not a random encounter. The ghost from his past was starting to stir the other ghosts of the town. Kane's reaction was swift and decisive. He could not allow Pope to become a liability. That afternoon, as Pope was stumbling his way from the saloon to his small shack, 2 of Kane's enforcers stepped out of an alley. There was no argument, no confrontation. They simply beat him, a brutal, methodical, and very public beating. They broke his arm, shattered his ribs, and left him unconscious in the street as a message to anyone else who might be thinking of dredging up the past. But the message had an unintended recipient. Luca, watching from his window, saw the entire thing. He saw the cold, professional brutality of Kane's men, and he saw the way the townspeople scurried away, their heads down, pretending not to see, their fear a palpable thing. Luca waited until nightfall. He slipped out of the boarding house and made his way to the small, dilapidated shack where the town doctor, under pressure from Kane's men, had unceremoniously dumped the beaten soldier. He found Pope lying on a dirty cot, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. Luca cleaned his wounds and set his arm with a rough but practiced skill, his movements gentle. Pope awoke to see the scarred, silent face of the youth's son looking down at him, terror warred with a new, dawning emotion in his eyes. "Why?" Pope rasped. "Because you and I," Luca said, his voice a low whisper in the darkness, "are the only 2 people in this town who remember the truth. And a man who remembers the truth, no matter how much he tries to drown it, is a man who can still be saved." He left Pope with a bottle of clean water and a piece of jerky. He had not gained an ally in a fight. Jedediah Pope was a broken man, his courage long since dissolved in alcohol. But he had confirmed the truth of his enemy's evil. And he had, perhaps, saved one of its first victims from himself. The act of tending to the old soldier had stirred something in Luca, a flicker of the man he had been before the fire, the man who had once believed in protecting the weak. The line between his cold, solitary vengeance and a larger, more complicated justice was beginning to blur. Nathaniel Cain was a man who understood the mechanics of power. His public beating of Jedediah Pope was a calculated move, a demonstration for the entire town. It was a message written in bruises and broken bones: the past is buried. Anyone who tries to dig it up will be buried with it. He expected the strange, silent half-breed to take the hint and disappear into the wilderness from which he had come. But Luka Redhawk did not run. His continued presence was an act of quiet, infuriating defiance. It was a challenge, and Cain knew he had to meet it head-on. He decided to escalate. He would not just intimidate Luka, he would publicly humiliate him, strip him of his mystique, and expose him as nothing more than a savage, a half-breed pretender in a white man's world. He chose his stage carefully, the town's annual marksmanship competition, a part of the Founders' Day celebration that Cain himself had created to celebrate his own legacy. It was the perfect venue to prove the superiority of the civilized man's weapon pistol over the primitive relics of a bygone era. The competition was held in a dusty clearing at the edge of town. The entire populace of Rio Vista was there, the mood a strange mixture of forced festivity and underlying tension. Cain's men were everywhere, their presence ensuring the crowd remained orderly and respectful. Cain himself presided over the event like a benevolent king, awarding cash prizes and offering hearty handshakes. The final event of the day was the pistol competition, a contest of speed and accuracy that was always won by one of Cain's top gunslingers. As the final contestants were lining up, Cain raised a hand for silence. "Friends, neighbors," he announced, his voice booming across the clearing. "We have a newcomer in our midst, a man of the wilds. It would be a fine show of frontier sportsmanship to invite him to compete, to show us the skills of his people." He turned, his eyes locking on Luka, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, a silent, watchful observer. "What do you say, friend? Will you honor us with a demonstration?" It was a perfectly laid trap. If Luka refused, he was a coward. If he accepted and lost, as Cain was certain he would, against his champion pistoler, would be humiliated, his mystique shattered. The entire town was watching. A slow, cruel smile played on Cain's lips. Luka stood motionless for a long moment. He looked at Cain, at the smug, confident faces of his hired guns, and at the curious, expectant faces of the townspeople. He understood the game perfectly. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He walked forward, not to the pistol-firing line, but to a spot 50 yards away, perpendicular to the targets. He unslung the sage-orange bow from his back. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not what they expected. Cain's smile faltered for a second, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "The competition is for the pistol," Cain said, his voice tight. "You invited me to show the skills of my people," Luka replied, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden hush. "This is the skill of my people." Cain, trapped by his own words, could do nothing but sneer and wave a hand in permission. "Very well. Have your little show." Cain's champion, a swaggering gunslinger named Reno, stepped up to the line. The targets were 3 whiskey bottles set on a railing 50 paces away. The challenge was to draw and break all 3 as fast as possible. Reno was a blur of motion. The roar of his Colt echoed through the clearing as he fired 3 shots in quick succession. When the smoke cleared, all 3 bottles were shattered. The crowd offered a smattering of nervous applause. Reno holstered his pistol with a flourish, a look of smug triumph on his face. Now it was Luka's turn. He stood, calm and centered, the bow held loosely in his hand. He did not aim at the spot where the bottles had been. He looked up at the sky. A lone hawk was circling high overhead, a dark speck against the bright, merciless blue. "Pull," he said, his voice soft. Reno, confused, looked at Cain, who gave a dismissive shrug. Reno drew his pistol, aimed at the sky, and pulled the trigger. A small, empty can, which had been balanced on the railing and seen by the crowd, was launched high into the air by a small, preset charge. What happened next was an act of impossible, breathtaking artistry. Luka's movements were a single, fluid dance. The bow came up, an arrow was knocked, the string drawn to his cheek. The bowstring sang. The arrow, a thin, dark line, streaked into the sky. It seemed to hang there for an impossible moment, a silent meeting of man's will and nature's grace. It struck the can at the very apex of its climb, a tiny plink that was barely audible. The arrow did not shatter the can, it pierced it perfectly through the center, carrying it onward for a few feet before the cane fell away, tumbling back to the earth. While the arrow continued its silent journey into the sky, the clearing was utterly, profoundly silent. The townspeople stared, their mouths agape, at the can lying in the dust with a perfectly round hole through it. They looked at Luca, who stood as if nothing had happened, the bow already lowered. He had not just demonstrated a skill. He had demonstrated a different kind of power, not the loud, brutal, explosive power of the gun, but a power that was silent, precise, and connected to the very air and sky. He had shown them magic. Reno, his face a mask of furious humiliation, lost his composure. "That's a damn trick," he snarled, and his hand dropped to his pistol. He never cleared the holster. Luca had a second arrow knocked before Reno's hand even moved. The bowstring sang again. This shot was not aimed at the sky. The arrow slammed into the dusty ground a single inch from the toe of Reno's boot, burying itself halfway to the fletching. It was a silent, deadly promise. Reno froze, his hand hovering over his gun, his face ashen. He looked into Luca's cold, gray eyes and saw his own death there. He slowly, carefully, raised his hand away from his pistol. Luca lowered his bow. He turned his back on the stunned gunslinger and the silent crowd. He did not look at Cain, whose face was a thunderous mask of pure hatred. He had accepted the challenge, and he had won, not by playing Cain's game, but by playing his own. He slung the bow over his shoulder and walked away, melting back into the shadows at the edge of the clearing, leaving a town in stunned silence and an enemy who now knew he was not dealing with a common drifter, but with a force he did not, and could not, understand. The marksmanship competition was a turning point. Luca's impossible shot and his silent, contemptuous victory over Reno had transformed him in the eyes of the town. He was no longer just a suspicious outsider, he was a figure of legend, a man who possessed a skill that bordered on the supernatural. But his victory had also ripped the last veil from Cain's animosity. The pretense of civilized disagreement was over. Cain now knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the ghost from the Gunnison, and he knew that Luca had come here to kill him. His response was to unleash the full force of the town's prejudice, to turn Luca's identity into a weapon against him. Cain's men moved through the saloons and the mercantile, spreading the truth like a poison. The quiet stranger was not just a half-breed, he was Luca Redhawk, the Utes' son, the traitorous scout who had led the army to his own people and then, in a fit of savagery, had turned on them. The story was a masterful, twisted inversion of the truth. It painted Luca not as a victim, but as a monster, a man of divided blood who was loyal to no one, a renegade who had come to Rio Vista to visit his savagery upon the good, civilized people of the town. The poison worked. The town's underlying fear and racism, which had been simmering just below the surface, now boiled over. The whispers that had followed Luca now became open jeers. Half-breed, traitor, savage, he was no longer a curiosity, he was a threat. Shopkeepers refused to sell to him. Children threw rocks at him from a safe distance. The entire community, under Cain's careful orchestration, turned against him. He was utterly alone, an outcast in a town that was now actively hostile. He became the hunted. It was during this time of absolute isolation that Luca found his one, and likely ally. Dr. Alistair Finch. A deliberate, ironic name choice was the town physician, a quiet, educated man from the east who had come west seeking not fortune, but a place where he could be of service. He was a man of science and reason, and he was deeply troubled by the fear and blind hatred he saw gripping the town. He had also been the one to sign the death certificates after the battle at the Gunnison 10 years ago, and the memory of the women and children's bodies, riddled not with arrow wounds but with army-issue bullets, had haunted him ever since. He found Luca one night, tending to his horse in the shadows behind the livery, a solitary figure in a world that had rejected him. "Red Hawk," the doctor said, his voice quiet. Luca's hand went to the bow that was never far from his reach, his body tensing. "I mean you no harm," the doctor said, holding up his hands. "I'm a man who believes in evidence. And the story that Captain Cain is telling doesn't match the evidence I saw with my own eyes 10 years ago." He paused. "I also believe a man should be judged by his actions, not his blood. And your actions have been those of a man of great restraint." In the small, lamplit confines of the doctor's office, over a glass of medicinal brandy, the two men formed a fragile, secret alliance. Luca, for the first time, spoke of the massacre, his voice a low, pained rasp, the words torn from a place of deep trauma. The doctor listened, his face a mask of grim compassion, his own long-held suspicions confirmed. "He's turned this town into his own private kingdom," the doctor said. "He controls everything. But his greatest weakness is his public image. He is desperate to be seen as a respectable, legitimate leader, the man who will bring the railroad, the man who will be the next state senator. If the truth of what happened at the Gunnison were to come out, it would destroy him." But they had no proof, only the word of a drunken, lying old soldier and a traitorous half-breed against that of the town's beloved founder. It was during this conversation that Luca finally allowed the full memory of the massacre to surface, a memory he had kept locked away in the darkest corner of his soul. Flashback. He was 20, a young man torn between two worlds but believing, with a desperate, youthful optimism, that he could be a bridge between them. He had joined the army as a scout, convinced by Captain Nathaniel Kane's promises. Kane was a charismatic, fatherly figure, a man who spoke of a new way, of reservations where the Ute would have their own land, protected by the government, where they could live in peace. Luca, whose own white father had abandoned him and his mother, had wanted to believe in this good, strong white man. He had seen Kane as a new father. His job was to act as a liaison, to carry messages, to guide the troopers, and to reassure his mother's people that Kane's intentions were honorable. The day of the massacre, Kane had sent him on a 3-day scouting mission far to the south, a fool's errand to track a non-existent band of renegade Apache. It was a ruse to get him out of the way. He had returned on the 3rd day to the smell of smoke on the wind. He had spurred his horse, a cold, terrible dread gripping him. He found his village, his home, utterly destroyed. The tipis were smoldering ruins. The bodies of his people were scattered where they had fallen, cut down as they ran from their beds. He saw the bodies of the warriors who had tried to fight back, but he also saw the bodies of the elders, of the women, of the children. He found his mother, Shada, near the riverbank. She was a proud, strong woman, the spiritual heart of their village. She lay on her back, her eyes open to the sky, a look of shocked betrayal on her face. The blue coat of a cavalryman lay discarded beside her, and her chest was soaked with blood from a saber wound. In her hand, she still clutched a single, hawk-feathered arrow, an arrow she had been fletching for him. He had knelt there, in the mud and blood, for a long time, the world dissolving into a gray, soundless fog of grief and rage. It was then that Captain Kane and a group of troopers had ridden up. "It was a tragedy, son," Kane had said, his face a mask of deep, sorrowful regret. "We were betrayed. They attacked us in the night. We had no choice but to defend ourselves." Luca had looked up at the man he had trusted, at the man he had seen as a father, and he saw the lie in his eyes. He saw the flicker of triumph, the cold, reptilian satisfaction. He saw the bloody saber on the hip of the sergeant next to Kane, and he understood. He didn't speak. He didn't scream. He simply stood up, his face a void. He turned his back on the soldiers, on the blue uniform he had once worn with pride. He walked to his mother's body, gently pried the arrow from her hand, and picked up her bow, which lay beside her. Then, without a word, without a backward glance, he had walked away, into the wilderness, leaving the world of men, both white and Ute, behind him. And flashback. "He will not stop until he has erased every last trace of what he did," Luca said to the doctor, his voice thick with the memory. "The town, the land, it's all part of the lie he has built to hide the truth." "Then we must give the truth a voice," the doctor replied. Luca, now a fugitive in his own homeland, left the doctor's office and slipped back into the wilderness that surrounded the town. He was no longer just a man seeking vengeance. He was the keeper of a stolen history, the last living witness to a massacre. He was the Ute's son. And from the darkness, he would begin to fight back, not just for his own past, but for the future of the valley itself. Driven from the dubious sanctuary of Rio Vista, Luca Redhawk did not flee. He melted into the landscape that had birthed him, the rugged and forgiving wilderness of canyons and mesas becoming his fortress and his weapon. The town had branded him a renegade, a savage. He would now give them one. He began to wage a war not of open battle, but of shadows and whispers, a campaign of psychological terror designed to unravel the carefully woven tapestry of Nathaniel Kane's authority. He became a ghost, his presence felt everywhere but seen nowhere, a constant, unnerving pressure on the fragile psyche of the town. His first targets were not men, but the symbols of Kane's progress. Kane was in the process of constructing a new bridge across a deep ravine, a vital link for the railroad spur he had promised his investors. It was a monument to his vision, built with timber from the clear-cut forests of the Outlands. One night, under a sliver of a moon, Luca moved with silent purpose. He did not use dynamite or fire. He used the skills of his ancestors. With a hand axe and a deep understanding of physics, he weakened the key support beams of the half-finished structure. The next morning, the town awoke to the sight of the great bridge, their symbol of a prosperous future, collapsed in a tangled, splintered ruin at the bottom of the ravine. There was no evidence of explosives, no tracks, no sign of human interference. It was as if the spirits of the land themselves had rejected Kane's intrusion. A current of superstitious fear began to ripple through the town. Next, he targeted Kane's cattle, the source of the wealth that had followed his acquisition of the Outlands. Luca did not rustle them. He hunted them. He would use his mother's bow to bring down a single, prize bull from a herd, performing the kill with the clean, ritualistic respect of a Ute hunter. He would butcher the animal, take a small portion of the meat for himself, and leave the rest, carefully laid out on a clean blanket of pine boughs, near the homestead of one of the poor families Kane had squeezed off their land. Pinned to the hide with a hawk-feathered arrow would be a simple piece of buckskin with a single Ute word drawn on it, Nankasunit, meaning justice or balance. These acts were more than mere sabotage, they were a form of storytelling. Luca was speaking to the people of the valley in a language older than words. He was reminding them that Kane's ownership was an illusion, that the land had a memory, and that its true masters had not forgotten. The stories of the ghost Ute began to spread, told in hushed tones in the saloon and around family dinner tables. He became a local legend, a phantom of righteous vengeance. To the homesteaders, he was a hero, a symbol of defiance. To Kane and his men, he was a terrifying, unseen menace. Kane's response was a wave of brutal, clumsy force that only served to further alienate him from the townspeople. He sent his enforcers on sweeps through the wilderness, a pack of hounds trying to catch the wind. They found nothing but frustration. They trampled the homesteads of suspected sympathizers, their heavy-handed interrogations turning fear into a deep, simmering resentment. The more Kane squeezed, the more the town's loyalty slipped through his fingers. Dr. Finch became the quiet heart of the resistance within the town. He used his position as the town's physician to move about freely, a trusted figure who was above suspicion. He acted as Luca's eyes and ears, treating the accidental injuries of Kane's men and listening to their drunken boasts and complaints in the saloon. He would leave messages for Luca in a hollowed-out log at the edge of town, messages containing information about patrol routes, supply shipments, and the growing paranoia within Kane's inner circle. It was through the doctor that Luca learned of Kane's Achilles heel. Kane was not just building a personal empire, he was deeply in debt to a syndicate of powerful investors from Denver, the men who were funding the railroad. He had promised them a valley that was pacified, productive, and ready for exploitation. The collapsed bridge, the rustled cattle, and the general state of unrest were making his investors nervous. He was on a deadline. He needed to eliminate the renegade problem and restore order, quickly, before his entire financial house of cards came tumbling down. This knowledge gave Luca a new strategic focus. He had to escalate the pressure, to make the valley ungovernable, to prove to Kane's backers that their investment was built on a foundation of quicksand. He decided to make a statement that could not be ignored. He learned from the doctor that a crucial wagon train, carrying mining equipment and a heavy payroll for Kane's workers, was due to arrive. It was heavily guarded, a moving fortress. A direct attack would be suicide. Luca, instead, planned an ambush that was pure psychological theater. He chose his location carefully, a narrow, winding pass in the mountains known as Echo Canyon, with the help of Jedediah Pope, the disgraced soldier who had found a sliver of redemption in aiding Luca. He spent a day preparing the trap. They did not plan to attack the wagon train itself, but to attack the minds of the men guarding it. As the wagon train entered the canyon, the guards were on high alert, their rifles ready. But the attack, when it came, was not of bullets. It was of sound. From the cliffs high above, a sound began to echo through the canyon, a low, mournful, and earthly wail. It was the sound of a Ute death chant, a sound Pope had taught Luca, a sound that every veteran of the Indian Wars knew and dreaded. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, amplified and distorted by the canyon walls. Then, from the rocks above, a single, hawk-feathered arrow arced down and buried itself in the wooden side of the lead wagon. Then another, and another. There were no war cries, no gunshots, just the terrifying, relentless silence punctuated by the death chant and the soft, whispery thud of arrows appearing from nowhere. The guards, already unnerved by the stories of the ghost Ute, broke. Their discipline shattered. They fired their rifles wildly at the empty cliffs, their bullets ricocheting with a useless whine. The teamsters, convinced they were being surrounded by an entire tribe of vengeful spirits, abandoned the wagons and fled in a state of blind panic. Luca and Pope had created the illusion of an army. When the chaos was at its peak, they triggered a small, carefully placed rock slide that blocked the pass, sealing the wagons in. They did not touch the payroll. They did not steal the equipment. They simply left the wagons there, abandoned in the haunted canyon, a monument to Kane's powerlessness. The news of the ghost ambush was the final straw. It shattered the morale of Kane's men and sent a wave of panic through his investors in Denver. The War of Shadows had been a stunning success. Luca had isolated his enemy, eroded his power base, and pushed him to the brink of desperation. The ghost had proven he was more powerful than the king. Now, he knew the cornered, desperate king would have no choice but to come out of his castle for one final, bloody confrontation. The failed payroll shipment was a fatal blow to Nathaniel Kane's carefully constructed facade of control. It was one thing to have a renegade ghost haunting the hills, it was another to have that ghost publicly halt the wheels of progress and profit. A terse, threatening telegram arrived from his investors in Denver, giving him an ultimatum: secure the valley and eliminate the hostile element within 2 weeks, or his funding would be cut off. And his loans called in. The message was clear. His empire was on the verge of collapse. The pressure cooker of Kane's mind, already simmering with a decade of paranoia and a fresh dose of humiliation, finally exploded. The cold, calculating strategist was consumed by the raging, cornered animal. He abandoned all pretense of winning the valley. His goal was now singular, primal, and absolute. He would find and kill Luca Redhawk, even if it meant burning his entire kingdom to the ground in the process. He gathered what was left of his private army, a core group of his most loyal and ruthless enforcers. He knew he could not find Luca in the wilderness. The ghost was a master of that domain. So, he devised a cruel and simple plan to draw the ghost out. He would not hunt Luca. He would hunt the people Luca had shown a flicker of compassion for. He would take a hostage. His target was Dr. Finch. Kane, in his paranoia, had long suspected the doctor of being more than he seemed. The man's quiet disapproval, his refusal to be intimidated, had grated on him. He saw the doctor not as a healer, but as a pocket of resistance, the intellectual heart of the town's silent defiance. And Kane knew, with the instinct of a predator, that Luca, the half-breed who had tended to the beaten Jedediah Pope, would not abandon another innocent to his fate. The abduction was swift and brutal. Kane's men stormed the doctor's small office in the middle of the night. They ransacked the place, searching for any evidence of his collusion with the renegade, and dragged the old man from his bed. They took him not to the town jail, but to the one place in the valley that held a deep, symbolic power for both Kane and Luca, the bend in the Gunnison River where the Ute village had been massacred. The place where it had all begun. Jedediah Pope, who had been sleeping in a drunken stupor in the alley behind the doctor's office, witnessed the entire thing. For the first time in 10 years, a feeling stronger than his craving for alcohol surged through him, a feeling of duty. He stumbled into the wilderness, his mind a fog of terror and newfound purpose, and began a desperate search for the one man who could stop this. He found Luca in a small, hidden cave, a place of meditation and memory. When Pope gasped out the story, Luca's face, usually a mask of stoic calm, hardened into something terrifying. This was a violation of the unwritten rules of their war. Kane had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had made the conflict personal in a new and unforgivable way. Luca knew it was a trap. He knew Cain would be waiting for him at the river. But it was a trap he had no choice but to walk into. He was bound by a debt, not just to his mother's memory, but to the quiet, courageous doctor who had shown him kindness, and to the broken soldier who had risked his life to bring him the warning. He did not go alone. He went to the small, scattered homesteads of the families he had helped, the people who saw him not as a renegade, but as a protector. He did not ask for an army. He spoke to them in the quiet, direct language of the Ute. He spoke of Nankasunit, of balance, of a debt that must be paid. A small, grim-faced group of ranchers and farmers, armed with their old hunting rifles and a fierce, protective loyalty, agreed to ride with him. He also had Pope, who, though shaking, held a rifle with a strange, new steadiness. They approached the Gunnison River under the cover of a moonless, starless night. The air was heavy and still, pregnant with impending violence. As they drew closer, they saw the glow of a large bonfire on the riverbank, a single, defiant eye of light in the vast darkness. Luca left his small band of allies hidden in the cottonwood trees that lined the riverbank, giving them simple, clear instructions. Then he walked out into the open, a solitary figure moving toward the firelight. He carried his mother's bow in one hand, his rusty Colt dragoon in the other. He was no longer a ghost in the shadows. He was a warrior, walking onto the battlefield to answer a final challenge. He reached the edge of the firelight and stopped. The scene before him was a tableau from hell. Dr. Finch was tied to a makeshift cross, his face bruised and bleeding, but his eyes defiant. Surrounding him were Cain and his 10 remaining enforcers, their faces hard and cruel in the flickering light, their guns all trained on Luca. "I knew you would come, you sentimental half-breed," Cain sneered, stepping forward, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He was drunk, his eyes alight with a feverish, manic energy. "I knew you couldn't resist playing the hero. A fatal flaw in both you and your mother." He took a long swallow of whiskey. "This is a historic spot, isn't it, Luca?" he said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "This is where civilization was born, in this valley. Right here. We tamed the wilderness. We brought progress. And all it cost was a little bit of house cleaning." "You call this progress?" Luca asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, his eyes never leaving Cain's. He gestured with his gun toward the bound and beaten doctor. "He's a necessary sacrifice," Cain said with a shrug. "Just like your people were. Sometimes, for the garden to grow, you have to pull the weeds." He raised his pistol, aiming it not at Luca, but at the doctor's head. "Now, you are going to drop your weapons. You are going to walk into this fire. And you are going to die, like the savage you are. And if you don't, your friend the good doctor dies first. The choice is yours, Red Hawk. And your pathetic little war, or get another innocent man killed." It was the ultimate, cruel test. Cain was forcing Luca to choose between his own life and the life of an innocent, the very dilemma that had haunted him for a decade. The river of memory, the site of his deepest trauma, was now the stage for his final, moral judgment. The firelight danced on the dark, swirling water of the Gunnison, making it look as if it were already running with blood. The air by the river was thick with the smell of wood smoke and hatred. The fire crackled, a hungry, living entity, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the faces of Cain's men. For a long, stretched moment, the only sound was the crackle of the flames and the soft, mournful sigh of the river. Luca stood at the edge of the light, a man balanced on the knife's edge of an impossible choice. He looked at Dr. Finch, tied to the crude cross. The old man's face was a mask of pain, but when his eyes met Luca's, he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't do it." It was the gesture of a man who had already made his peace, a man who was refusing to be a pawn in Cain's sick game. Luca then looked at Cain. He saw the manic, drunken glee in the man's eyes, the triumphant cruelty of a bully who believed he had finally, irrevocably won. Cain was not just trying to kill him, he was trying to destroy his soul, to force him into a final act of surrender that would negate every principle he had fought for. Cain wanted to prove that in the end, everyone, even the stoic, vengeful Red Hawk, would kneel to save their own skin or the skin of another. And in that moment of absolute clarity, Luca understood. He could not win this by Cain's rules. He could not save the doctor by surrendering. A man like Cain would kill them both anyway, savoring the victory of having broken him first. The only way to win was to reject the choice itself, to change the board entirely. "You're right, Kane," Lucas said, his voice calm, conversational, an unnerving counterpoint to the tension of the scene. "It's time to end it." He slowly, deliberately, lowered his Colt Dragoon, placing it on the ground in front of him. He then unslung his mother's bow and placed it gently beside the gun. He stood, empty-handed, his palms open, a gesture of absolute surrender. A triumphant, ugly grin spread across Kane's face. "I knew it," he hissed. "I knew you were a coward at heart." He gestured with his pistol. "Now walk. Walk into the fire." Luca took a single step forward. Then he stopped. He looked not at Kane, but up at the dark, impenetrable wall of cottonwood trees that lined the riverbank. And he gave a single, piercingly clear, impossibly loud whistle call of a red-tailed hawk. The night exploded. It was not a volley of gunfire. It was something far more terrifying, far more primal. From the darkness of the trees, a dozen arrows arced through the night air, silent, feathered messengers of death. They were not aimed at Kane or his men. They were aimed at the lanterns that had been hung around the camp, and at the torches stuck in the ground. The arrows found their marks with deadly precision. The lanterns shattered, plunging the edges of the camp into sudden, disorienting darkness. The torches were knocked from their stands, their flames setting patches of the dry riverbank grass alight. In the first few seconds of chaos and confusion, as Kane's men spun around, firing wildly into the darkness, Luca moved. He was not a man anymore. He was a blur, a predator in his element. He dove for his weapons, hurling through the dirt and coming up with the Colt in one hand and the bow in the other. At the same time, the second phase of his plan erupted. Jedediah Pope, the broken soldier, found his redemption. From his position in the trees, he fired his rifle not at a man, but at a crate of whiskey he had seen the outlaws unloading. The bullet shattered the crate, and the high-proof liquor ignited from a nearby, fallen torch. A wall of blue and orange flame shot up, separating Kane and his two closest guards from the rest of their men, who were now trapped between the fire and the river, under a relentless, terrifyingly accurate hail of arrows from the homesteaders hidden in the trees. The carefully staged execution had become a chaotic, fiery ambush. Kane's men, caught completely by surprise, their vision ruined by the sudden shift from bright light to near total darkness, panicked. They were being attacked by an unseen enemy, their camp was on fire, and their leader was cut off. Kane, his drunken triumph turning to sober, panicked rage, spun back toward Luca, who was now a mere 10 paces away, a grim, avenging specter emerging from the smoke. Kane fired his pistol, but his shot was wild, rushed. Luca did not fire back. He knocked an arrow, the movement a single, fluid, practiced motion. He drew the string. His target was not Kane. The bowstring sang. The arrow streaked through the firelight and struck the rope that bound Dr. Finch's right hand to the cross, severing it with a clean walk. "Now, Kane," Luca's voice roared, for the first time filled with the full, unrestrained fury he had held in check for a decade. "It's just you and me, the way it should have been." He dropped the bow and raised the heavy, rusty Colt Dragoon. Kane, his face a mask of utter disbelief and hatred, raised his own pistol. The two men stood, separated by a wall of fire, the ghosts of the past swirling in the smoke around them. The price of a soul was about to be paid here, on this bloody, haunted ground, and the currency was lead. The world by the Gunnison River had been reduced to a primal, elemental chaos of fire, water, and shadow. The battle was no longer a structured ambush, but a series of desperate, brutal skirmishes in the disorienting, smoke-filled darkness. The homesteaders, led by Pope, kept the bulk of Kane's men pinned down by the riverbank, their arrows a constant, terrifying threat that was more effective at sowing panic than their rifles would have been. Dr. Finch, freed from the cross by Luca's incredible shot, had scrambled into the relative safety of the trees. But at the heart of the inferno, the larger battle had contracted to a single, personal duel. Luca and Kane faced each other through the shimmering, wavering curtain of the burning whiskey wall, their faces illuminated in the hellish light, their pistols leveled. "You should have died in that village with your mother," Kane screamed, his voice a raw, ragged thing, stripped of all its cultivated charm. "You are a ghost. A mistake." "I am her son," Luca replied, his own voice a low, steady growl, a counterpoint to Kane's hysteria. I am the debt you forgot to pay. They both fired. The two gunshots, a heavy, booming roar from Luca's dragoon and a sharp crack from Kane's peacemaker, were almost simultaneous. Kane's bullet tore through the sleeve of Luca's buckskin shirt, a searing line of heat across his skin. Luca's shot was true. It caught Kane in the left shoulder, the heavy slug spinning him around and knocking him to his knees with a grunt of pain. But Kane was a man animated by a core of pure, venomous hatred. He staggered back to his feet, his left arm hanging useless, his face a mask of agony and fury. He fired again, wildly, the bullet ricocheting off a rock near Luca's head. Luca did not fire back. He walked, slowly and deliberately, through the wall of fire. The flames licked at his buckskin leggings and his duster, but he moved with a steady, relentless purpose, emerging on the other side like a demon from the flames, his face grim, his gray eyes burning with a cold, terrifying light. The sight of this man, seemingly impervious to fire, a figure of pure, unstoppable vengeance, finally broke what was left of Kane's nerve. He turned and fled. He scrambled away from the fire, toward the dark, swirling waters of the Gunnison River, the place where he had committed his original sin, as if seeking some kind of perverse sanctuary. Luca pursued him, not running, but walking with that same, inexorable pace. The chase ended at the river's edge. Kane, his shoulder bleeding freely, his lungs heaving, stumbled and fell into the shallows. He tried to raise his pistol, but his hand was shaking too badly. Luca stopped a few feet away, standing on the bank, looking down at the man who had destroyed his world. "Please," Kane gasped, the last of his fight gone, replaced by a pathetic, primal fear. "Money. I have gold. You can have it all." Luca looked down at the pathetic, groveling man, the great Captain Kane, the founder of Rio Vista, now just a wounded animal in the mud. He thought of his mother's body, of the look of shocked betrayal in her eyes. He thought of the decade of his own life he had lost, a decade spent as a ghost, haunted by this man's evil. He raised the Colt dragoon, its pitted, rusty barrel seeming to absorb the firelight. He saw it all in that moment, the blood, the fire, the broken promises. He saw the line he had lived on his entire life, the line between two worlds, between two philosophies. His mother had taught him the way of the bow, the way of the UTO way of balance, of taking only what you need, of respecting the life you take. The white world, Kane's world, had taught him the way of the Guna way of extermination, of taking all you can, of killing for sport and profit and power. He had lived as a bounty hunter, using the skills of both worlds but belonging to neither. Now, he had to make a final choice. He could pull the trigger, end Kane's life with the brutal and personal efficiency of the gun, and in doing so, become the very thing Kane had always accused him of being, a killer, a savage. Or he could choose a different kind of justice. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the pistol. He uncocked the hammer and tucked the gun back into his belt. Then, he unslung his mother's bow. He knocked his last arrow, the one he had taken from his mother's hand on the day she died. The hawk-feathered arrow. Kane stared, his eyes wide with confusion and terror. What are you doing?" "My mother taught me that the bow is for the hunt," Luca said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, but carrying with it the weight of a sacred law. "It is for taking a life with respect, to honor the spirit of what you kill. The gun is for men like you. For butchers." He drew the bowstring, those sage orange-wood groaning softly, a sound like a prayer. "But you are not a man. You are a disease. And my people, we do not hunt disease. We cut it out." He did not fire the arrow. Instead, he reached back and drew the long, heavy hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. He let the bow and arrow fall into the river. He waded into the water, the knife held low and ready. This would not be a long-range and personal killing. This would be a final, intimate accounting, a debt paid hand to hand, eye to eye, here in the dark, bloody water of the Gunnison, the river of memory. This would be the Ute son, finally, irrevocably, choosing his side of the line. The final confrontation in the shallows of the Gunnison was not a battle, it was an execution. Kane, wounded and terrified, tried to scramble away, but his strength was gone. Luca moved with the fluid, deadly grace of a panther, the river water swirling around his legs. The fight, if it could be called that, was short and brutal. It ended with Kane on his back in the water, Luca's knee on his chest, a hunting knife at his throat. They looked at each other in the dying firelight, two men whose destinies had been forged and then shattered in this very spot 10 years ago. Cain's eyes were wide with the final, absolute terror of a man staring into the face of his own damnation. Luca's eyes were filled with a decade of pain, a universe of loss, and a cold, clear, final purpose. "This is for Shada," Luca whispered, and with a single, clean motion, he drew the blade across Cain's throat. He held him for a moment as the life drained out of him, his blood turning the dark river water an even deeper shade of red. Then, he let the body go, and it was carried away by the current, a final, bloody offering to the ghosts of the past. Luca stood in the river for a long time, the water washing over him, as if trying to cleanse him of the last 10 years. He was not triumphant. He was not satisfied. He was just empty. The great, burning fire of vengeance that had been his only companion, his only reason for living, had been extinguished. And in its place, there was only a vast, aching silence. He waded back to the shore. The fighting was over. The surviving outlaws had surrendered to the homesteaders. Jedediah Pope, the broken soldier, stood guard over them, his rifle held steady, his face filled with a new, sober dignity. Dr. Finch was tending to the wounded. The battle was won. In the days that followed, the world changed. The news of Cain's death and the exposure of his crimes, corroborated by the doctor and the other townspeople, brought the territorial marshals. Cain's empire crumbled. His corrupt deputies were arrested. His fraudulent land deeds were nullified. The valley was, for the first time, truly free. A town meeting was held. The homesteaders, the ranchers, and the people of Rio Vista, now united by their shared ordeal, offered Luca anything he wanted. They offered him land, a position of leadership, a home. He was their hero, their savior. He stood before them, in the town's small, newly repaired church. He looked at their hopeful, grateful faces. He saw Dr. Finch, Jedediah Pope, and the others, all looking at him as the leader of their new community. And he knew he could not stay. He was not a builder. He was not a leader of men. He was a hunter, and his hunt was over. "This land was never mine to take," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the silent church. "It belongs to the memory of those who lived here first. And it belongs to you, who have earned it with your courage. Build something good here. Build something worthy of their memory." He left the next morning, at dawn. He rode not east, back to the white world, nor west, deeper into the Ute lands. He simply rode north, toward the high mountains, toward the promise of solitude. He carried his mother's bow, but his quiver was empty, save for one last arrow. The hawk-feathered arrow he had taken from his mother's hand. He did not look back. He was no longer a ghost, and he was no longer a bounty hunter. He was Luca Red Hawk, the Ute's son, a man who had finally paid his debts, and in doing so, had paid the price of his own soul. He rode into the wilderness, a solitary, free man at last, leaving behind him a town reborn, and a legend that would be whispered along the banks of the Gunnison River for generations to come. Its story of the man who had crossed the line to protect them, and had crossed it one last time. Not for vengeance, but for justice.